There is a kind of silence that settles over stone, not the kind you find in a forest or even in a church, but something heavier. It's the kind of hush that gathers where things have stood for too long, watched too much. A quiet that hums under the sun, soaked deep into carved walls and half-fallen blocks. And if you listen closely, really closely, it feels like the dust is still whispering. Somewhere in the desert, not in the glory of a coronation hall, not beneath the golden mask of a pharaoh, but farther out, there's a man bent over a cracked slab of limestone. His tunic is stiff with sweat. The wind is dry and hot and full of sand. He is not an architect. He is not a high priest. He is just a man with a chisel, trying to make the ancients seem eternal. We talk a lot about how pyramids were built, but this is not a story about grand designs or divine geometry. This is a story about after, long after the scaffolds were gone, long after the pharaohs had turned to myth, when the pyramids were already cracked, already vandalized, already sinking quietly into sand. And someone quietly was told to go patch them up. In the quiet shadow of greatness, there is always someone with dust in their eyes and sore knees. Tonight, we're going to slow time down. We'll walk not into the height of Egyptian splendor, but into its slow, unglamorous maintenance. Into the heat, the stone, the tedium, and the forgotten men who kept these colossal things from falling apart entirely. This is deep history for sleepers. And if you're still listening later, I'd love to know what part stayed with you. Now, let's drift backward to around 1200 BCE. You're not a king. You're not a soldier. You're a pyramid repairman. And your day starts before the sun does. You're not alone on the site, but it rarely feels like anyone's really with you. The other laborers move like shadows, hunched, dusty, silent most of the time. You know their names mostly. You've seen their children, their sandals, their bad teeth. But you don't talk much unless you have to. Talking takes breath, and breath is a luxury when you're reworking under the weight of a midday sun and a collapsing dynasty. Now and then, someone makes a joke, a dry one, about how the pharaoh should come down and fix it himself. No one laughs loudly, just a snort or two, maybe a crooked smile. It's enough. There's camaraderie and shared suffering, even if it's too hot to look each other in the eye. What's strange is how little direction you actually get. The foreman points, grunts, gestures vaguely toward a cracked lintel or a weathered inscription. And you know what that means? Scrape, clean, patch. You've learned how to do it by watching others, copying the rhythms handed down like half-remembered songs. There are no formal instructions, just a slow, handed-down dance with stone and time. Sometimes, when you lean in close, you can still see the tool marks from the original builders, finer than yours, somehow cleaner. As if they had more time, more purpose. Or maybe they were just better fed. You'll never know. But it humbles you, seeing the fingerprints of men long dead, etched in the things they left behind. They built with ambition. You work with resignation. Around midday, the sky burns white. There's no such thing as shade anymore. Even the pyramid itself radiates heat like a kill. You wrap the cloth tighter around your head and press on, chipping at a broken cornice that's starting to lean. It's the kind of job you know won't last, just a patch on top of a patch. But if you don't fix it, someone more important might come by, and then the foreman might yell. Or worse, stop paying. Somewhere in the distance, a group of schoolchildren is herded past by a priest in faded robes. They don't look at you. You're part of the background. To them, you're a dusty silhouette, no different from the columns or rubble. You wonder what they're learning. Probably something about gods and greatness. Not about men like you, sweating through your bones to keep history from falling over. Sometimes, at the top of the structure, you pause, not to admire the view, but to breathe. The city spreads out in the shimmering heat, its clay rooftops glowing like embers under the sun. The river glints far away, too far. You envy it, how it flows without worry, without repair. No one expects the river to be perfect, but the pyramid must stay still. Your father did this work too, for a while. He used to come home with bits of stone in his hair, the same way you do now. You remember the way he used to sit by the doorway, rubbing his knees and muttering about lazy overseers and stingy foremen. You never thought you'd end up here too. You imagined something better. But dreams have a way of dissolving when the bread is thin and your neighbors are hungry. Evening brings no real coolness, only a softer kind of heat. You drag yourself down the scaffolds, past half-crumbled storage rooms and faded wall carvings, your muscles trembling with fatigue. The foreman doesn't say goodbye. He nods, faintly. You nod back. That's as much ceremony as you'll ever get. You pass the same shrine on the way home each day, a small, soot-darkened altar to one of the lesser gods. You used to stop and murmur a prayer. Now, mostly, you just glance at it, out of habit more than belief. The gods feel far away from here. Maybe they were closer when the pyramid was young. Or maybe they were never really here at all. You try not to think about what happens if you get sick. There's no spare crew, no pension, just fewer coins in your house and a different man brought in to swing the mallet. You're not irreplaceable. You're not even remembered. Dinner is thin stew, as usual. A few beans, a heel of bread, cracked and dry. Your youngest son complains about it, and your wife gives him a look that shuts him up fast. There isn't more. There never is. You eat in silence, grateful for the stillness, if not the flavor. Later, lying on your mat in the half-dark, you think about the crack in the west wall, the one you didn't finish today. You meant to pack it with mortar, but the light was fading and your wrist had gone numb. It'll still be there tomorrow, waiting. You fall asleep with dust still clinging to your arms. You don't dream of greatness. You dream of shade and clean water, and maybe a day when no one needs anything from you. More than just dust, the weight of a job no one sees. There's something odd about working on something that was meant to last forever, when you know, with absolute certainty, that nothing does. You're surrounded every day by stone that was quarried centuries before your grandparents were born. Every block has stories it will never share. You feel them beneath your hands, the pits, the cracks, the fingerprints and dried plaster. But you don't know the names of the men who placed them. You never will, just as no one someday will know yours. Still, you get up before dawn again and again. You've stopped keeping track of how many mornings it's been like this. They all bleed together into a sun-bleached blur, a string of rising suns, aching joints, and falling dust. There are worse jobs, of course. At least you're not in the copper mines. Not hauling stone in a quarry with a rope belt around your waist. But still, there's no joy in this. No spark. Only the quiet rhythm of erosion and the equally quiet, equally futile rhythm of resistance. Today's task is repairing the steps on the north side, or what's left of them. The old blocks are badly worn, not from feet, but from the wind and animals. And time. You chip away loose fragments, pack the joints with a muddy mixture of sand, lime, and water, then wedge in new pieces, shaped roughly with your chisel. There's no beauty in the fix. It's not meant to be seen. It's just meant to hold. Above you, a stork circles in the pale sky. You watch it lazily for a moment. It's the only creature here that moves with any elegance. You envy its wings. It never has to carry tools or sweat through 3 tunics. The sun is barely up, and you're already soaked through. Not from movement, but from the heat that rises from every surface. The pyramid doesn't cool. It just holds the warmth from yesterday and builds on it. Even in the shadows, the air feels thick. It's not the kind of heat that burns quickly. It's the kind that seeps in. It's behind your eyes and under your fingernails. You take a sip from your water skin. The liquid is warm and tastes faintly of leather, but it's wet, and that's enough. You rinse your mouth and spit into the dust. Immediately, the sand absorbs it, vanishes it, like it was never there. You get back to work. Each block tells a story of how little control you have. You've seen them split down the middle for no reason. You've seen mortared scenes explode after a rare rainfall. You've seen cracks that seem to heal themselves, and others that keep growing no matter how much filler you pack in. There's no manual for this, only memory. Sometimes you do what your father did. Sometimes you copy the guy next to you. Sometimes, when no one is looking, you just guess. Lunch comes late today. You forgot to pack anything, but one of the other workers, an older man named Benin, tears his flatbread in half and passes it to you. You nod in thanks. He nods back. Neither of you speaks. There's no need. There's a strange kind of intimacy in shared silence, in calloused hands meeting the same surface day after day. While you chew, your eyes wander to the graffiti. It's not on the visible parts of the pyramid, but tucked into side chambers and shadowed corners. Scribbles from generations of workers, names, jokes, prayers. One says, "Hate this job." Another simply reads, "Still here." You think about adding your own, but what would you write? What could possibly be said that hasn't been said already? Back on your feet, the hours blur again. You work without thought, letting your hands remember what your mind has forgotten. Tap, scrape, brush, patch. It is like being part of a heartbeat you didn't ask for. A thump of labor pulsing through time. Later, a small delegation of priests wanders near the site. You watch them from the corner of your eye. They're dressed in clean linens, even in this heat, and their sandals are polished. One points at something and frowns. Another writes on a tablet. None of them come near the wall you're fixing. None of them acknowledge you. You don't mind. Not really. But it reminds you of how invisible you are, how the people who claim to serve the gods don't deserve the stone that holds their temples up. You remember a story your father once told you about a man who carved a column so perfectly that a high priest declared it a gift from Thoth himself. The man was offered a silver ring and a seat at a feast. You've never met anyone like that. You think your father made it up. There are no gifts now. Only wages, small, inconsistent, always late. You stretch your back against the slope of the structure and stare at a chip in the stone. It's shaped a little like a falcon's wing. You trace it absent-mindedly with your fingertip, wondering how long it will last before someone else chisels it away or fills it in. Probably not long. Nothing small survives here. Only the big things. The monuments, the lies. Sometimes, when you lie awake at night, you wonder what would happen if you just stopped. If everyone stopped. If the whole country gave up the pretense of being eternal and let the sand take it all. Would it even matter? The priests would chant. The scribes would write. The kings would die. And the monuments would crumble slowly, like they're doing anyway. Just a little faster. But you don't stop. No one does. Because there's always another crack. Another shift. Another sun. You finish the day with your arms trembling from the effort of lifting a new block into place. It's too big, really, not shaped well, but it's what you've been given, so you wedge it into the gap with your full weight. You hear it scrape against the older stones, then settle with a low, grinding sigh. You wipe your forehead and leave your palm print on the face of the stone. No one will notice, but you like the idea of it staying there. Quietly, fading slowly. Like you, the walk home is slower than usual. The ache in your thighs has turned into something deeper. A kind of warmth that feels like it might catch fire if you keep moving. But you do. Step by step. As you pass through the edges of the village, you see the boys playing with stones again, rolling them down the slope of a dune, pretending they're chariots. You remember when your own son did that, before he got old enough to know the difference between fantasy and labor. You get home. You sit. You don't speak for a long time. Your wife brings you a bowl of lentils. You eat with your hands, slowly. She doesn't ask how the day went. She knows. It's always the same. Later, when she's asleep, you sit outside and stare at the sky. The stars feel heavy tonight, like they're pressing down on everything. You think about the pyramid, still standing, barely, and wonder how many of those stars were shining when it was built. Probably all of them. And maybe, long after you're gone, they'll still be there, watching as it sinks, watching as the cracks widen again, watching the next man try to fill them. Season after season, the stone doesn't care. There is something strange that happens when you work the same stones through the change of seasons. You begin to feel like the stones are watching you, not actively, not with malice or interest, but with a kind of patient, dull indifference, as if they've seen too much to care what happens now. And maybe they have. The air has changed. It's cooler now. Not cold, not by any means, but you notice the way the mornings bite just slightly more. The wind carries a different kind of grit. Not the raw heat of summer, but something drier, sharper. It scrapes along the pyramid's base and sifts into every crease of your clothing. You've been through enough flood seasons to know what comes next. The river will swell, the banks will vanish underwater, and then the soil will bloom again. But here, in this dust-choked corner of the necropolis, nothing blooms. Only dust settles. Only cracks widen. Today you reassign to clear debris from a collapsed lintel near the base of the west side. It's thankless work. You scrape away layers of sand that the wind has been laying down for a century. Then you haul away chunks of fallen stone, some too large to lift without help. The scaffolding nearby creaks as someone above you shifts their weight. You don't look up. You don't need to. You already know who it is. Camus, the young one who still thinks this work might lead to something better. Let him dream. You don't have the heart to take that from him yet. You reach down and feel a chip of limestone that doesn't belong. It's not from the pyramid, not this one anyway. It's been carried in by the wind, maybe from a crumbled tomb farther up the ridge. You roll it between your fingers. It's been carved, faintly, a line, maybe two, too worn to read. You think briefly of all the names lost to wind and time. Then you toss it aside and go back to shoveling sand. The foreman doesn't come today. He's probably been reassigned to a project upriver, some palace wall in need of repainting before a visiting noble arrives. No one tells you where the foreman goes, or why. He just vanishes, like a bird flying out of frame. And someone else takes his place, older, stricter, quieter. This new one has a crooked walk and a voice like a dry reed. He doesn't speak unless something's gone wrong. You work slower, because there's no rush. The stones aren't going anywhere. Neither are you. By late morning, your hands are sore again. The same spots, the same ache. It never fully heals. You wrap your fingers in linen strips to ease the rawness, but the stone always finds its way through. It wears you down the way water wears rock, slowly, insistently, until one day you crack. Some days, the work feels almost meditative, like prayer. Not the kind of prayer that asks for things, but the kind that simply repeats itself, over and over, not to be heard, but because silence feels heavier. You used to pray for strength, for safety, for enough coin to last the week. Now, when you pray, if you pray, it's more like murmuring into the wind. No words, just breath. Just the shape of hope, without the details. The noon sun is weaker these days, but still enough to sting. You eat your bread on a flat rock, sipping water slowly to make it last. You watch the sand swirl in tight little cyclones near the outer perimeter of the site. It makes you think of something, not a memory, exactly, but a feeling, of watching your children chase dust devils, laughing years ago. They don't laugh as much now. Life presses down faster when you're poor. Camus drops down next to you with a heavy sigh. He's got a scrape on his forehead, probably from brushing too close to one of the sharp scaffolding nails. He doesn't complain, just tilts his head back and stares at the sky. You do the same. For a moment, neither of you says anything. Then he asks, "Do you ever wonder if we're making it worse?" You turn to look at him. His eyes are closed. He's not joking. You shrug. It was already worse before we got here. He laughs once, a dry sound. Yeah, but now it's our job to keep pretending it's not. You don't reply. What could you say that wouldn't sound tired? The day drags on. You move more debris, shift more stone, smooth down an edge that no one will ever see. You know this area will be buried again by the next windstorm. All your work erased like writing in wet clay. But still, you do it. Because what else is there? The Empire is aging. You can feel it in the way the orders arrive later now, scrawled on cheaper papyrus. The wages too. Fewer coins, longer delays, more excuses. The gods, the temples, the monuments, they still stand, but everything underneath is softening, eroding, and the pyramid repair crew is where it shows first. When the system breaks, it always breaks at the bottom. You finish your task in silence. The new overseer nods once as you walk past. That's enough. You nod back. It's the closest thing to a thank you you'll get all month. That night, you wake up from a dream of falling, not from a great height, but from a scaffold, arms flailing, landing hard on old stone. You can still feel the jolt in your chest, even as you sit up in the dark. Your heart races. Your mouth is dry. You drink from a small bowl beside your sleeping mat and lie back down. But sleep doesn't return easily. You stare at the ceiling and count breaths. Then you listen to your wife's quiet breathing beside you, the rustle of dry rushes outside the door, the faint calls of night birds over the river. You think about the pyramid, still there, still broken, still waiting. And you know, tomorrow, you'll return. Because someone always has to. The pyramid will outlive you, but that was never the point. There is a silence that settles over your life after enough years doing this work. Not the silence of rest, but a different kind. A quiet that comes from knowing the shape of each day before it begins. A stillness in the bones. You don't notice when it starts. One morning you wake up and realize you haven't dreamed of anything in months. You haven't asked questions. You haven't looked forward. You've just continued. There's no ceremony to mark your 20th year working the stones. No garland, no thanks. No one even brings it up. You mention it once, softly, to another man while smoothing mortar into a cracked joint, and he shrugs and says, 20, huh? Guess that makes you part of the pyramid now. You both laugh, not because it's funny, but because it's too true. The pyramid hasn't changed much. The cracks are different, the colors duller, some of the scaffolds rebuilt again and again. But its face is the same, massive, unblinking. You wonder sometimes if it even notices you. By now, you know every slope and crevice of the site. You know where to step, where the stone is most worn, which blocks shift slightly when you walk across them. You've memorized the smell of old dust. You can tell the age of a fallen block by the sound it makes when you knock your knuckles against it. You've trained others, new boys brought in, when the old ones fell ill or gave up. You show them how to lift with their legs, how to use their tools without wasting motion, how to tell the difference between a harmless crack and a dangerous one. You try to warn them gently, but most don't stay long. The pay is low, the sun is harsh. The hope, if they had any, burns off fast. Once one of them asked you, "Why do you stay?" You didn't have an answer then. You said something about needing the money, about having no other trade. But the truth is harder to name. The truth is, you've built your whole life around this rhythm. If you stopped, what would fill the silence? The sight changes in tiny ways. The stone darkens with time. The wind erodes inscriptions once sharp enough to draw blood. The desert encroaches slowly every season. And still you patch, still you scrape, still you return. Some mornings you stand at the base and look up at the structure. Really look and feel something deep in your chest. It's not awe, exactly, not pride. More like a kind of reverent sadness. You know this monument better than anyone alive, and you also know that none of it remembers you. You've watched others walk past, priests, tax collectors, even once a foreign envoy who stared at the pyramid as if it were magic. They never see you. You're part of the scaffolding. You're part of the rock, invisible, necessary, forgotten, and yet you keep coming back. Your hands are rough now, not just calloused, but shaped by the work itself. Your knuckles are swollen, your wrists stiff, but when you touch stone, you feel something settle. A memory, maybe, or a purpose, dull and unspoken. Your children are older now. Your eldest son works upriver, doing something with papyrus ledgers. Cleaner work, easier on the body. He doesn't understand why you still do this. He asked once if you were angry that your life turned out this way. You didn't answer. What would be the point? Anger is a fire that goes out quickly in the wind. You've stopped waiting for things to get better. That's not bitterness. It's simply truth. The state has always promised more, but the cracks keep growing. The coin gets lighter. The overseers change, but the silence stays the same. So instead, you find moments of meaning in the smallest things. The curve of a well-fit patch. The way mortar dries smooth under your fingers. The familiar creak of the wooden scaffold you repaired last season. A bird landing on a finished corner. The smell of earth after a rare rain. You begin to see the pyramid differently. Not as a monument, but as a companion. A stubborn, quiet creature that bears time like a wound. You're not saving it, but you're refusing to let it vanish quietly. You're holding space. That matters, even if no one says so. Sometimes, on days when the air is soft and the wind doesn't sting, you walk along the base with your hand on the stone. Just walking. No task, just presence. You imagine that the pyramid knows you, that it recognizes the weight of your footsteps, that it remembers. Maybe it's foolish, but so is everything else. One day, you arrive at the site and find a new crack along the northern base. Deep, sharp. It wasn't there last week. You run your fingers across it. The stone pulls your skin into its jagged line. It will take days to patch, maybe longer. You sit beside it in the dust, not moving, just watching the sunlight trace its edges. And for some reason, that's the moment you finally understand something. You haven't been trying to preserve the pyramid. You've been trying to slow down time, to hold back the inevitable, even if just by minutes. Every chisel strike, every patch, it's a gesture against forgetting. Not for the empire, not for the pharaohs, but for the nameless, the tired, the men like you who have been crushed under someone else's legacy. And still, you go to work. You press mortar into the crack. You work slowly, carefully, even though no one will thank you, even though it will likely break again. You do it because the work itself has become your memory, your proof of being. You finish the day aching, as always, but something sits easier in your chest. That night, you tell your wife about the crack, about how deep it was. She nods, says nothing. You sit beside her and watch the fire fade to coals. You don't need to say more. The next morning, before the sun is even up, you rise. You wrap your tools in cloth. You tie your sandals. You step into the cool darkness and begin walking. Dust, silence, and temptation. The tomb never really felt empty, even after all these years. Even when the offerings had been stripped, the plaster peeled away, the once bright murals faded into dull, flaking ghosts of color. It still watched you. That's what stayed with you, long after the others had left. The sense of being observed. Not by the dead exactly, though their names were carved into the walls, their eyes painted in profile, but by something deeper. A stillness older than words. The feeling of a space not meant for breath. And yet, you went inside. No one wakes up one morning and decides to become a tomb robber. It happens slowly, like a crack in a temple wall. At first, it's barely noticeable. A single missed payment. A hungry child. A job that promises silver, but pays in barley. And then a whisper. A suggestion. A friend of a friend who knows someone who knows the entrance to a sealed chamber. You were a scribe once. Not high-ranking, not important. Just one of many. You copied tax rolls, death ledgers, burial permits. You understood how the system worked. Who had what? Who owed who? You knew where things were buried. Not just the bodies, but the bribes, the lies, the shame. You also knew that most tombs weren't guarded like they used to be. Not anymore. The great tomb inspectors had retired or died. The priests were stretched thin, too busy maintaining temple rituals for a dynasty that was starting to collapse under its own weight. Inflation, drought, rebellion, it was all slipping. And so you slipped too. The first time, it wasn't gold you were after. Just food, a little linen, an old amulet you thought you could sell quietly. You told yourself the tomb had already been looted. You told yourself the body wouldn't care. You told yourself the gods weren't watching. You were wrong. You entered through a crack in the cliff face above the workers' cemetery. You and another man, Kenny, moved through the narrow passage with torches made of twisted reed. The smoke curled into black fingerprints on the ceilings. The air was thick, motionless, like syrup poured over stone. There was a door, still sealed with wax and stamped clay. You stared at it for a long time. The stamp bore the name of a forgotten priest. Not a king, not a noble. Just a man once important enough to be buried with a title. Kenny said, "He won't miss it." You didn't answer. You pressed your hand to the door and felt the chill. The seal cracked beneath a careful stone. Inside, the passage sloped downward, the silence growing heavier with every step. You could hear your own heartbeat echoing off the walls. The torch flickered, casting shadows of long-ago painters and masons whose hands had shaped the space and then vanished. The burial chamber was small, humble. There was no gold, just a single sarcophagus carved from pale limestone. A few canopit jars, untouched, a scarab necklace on a broken shelf. Cunny moved quickly, like he was used to this. He took the necklace, dug through an offering basket, snapped a piece of ivory in two. You stood still, listening. And then you heard it, not a sound exactly, more like the lack of one. A stillness so complete, it felt like it had weight. Like the tomb itself had inhaled and was waiting to exhale. You left quickly. Kenny laughed at you outside. "You're too soft," he said. "That priest's been dead 200 years. If he cared, he'd have cursed me already." You didn't laugh. You didn't speak. You went home and burned incense, just in case. You whispered an apology you weren't sure you meant. And still, that night, you didn't sleep. But the next week, you went again. And again the week after. Because once you cross that threshold, it becomes easier each time. Not cleaner, not safer, but easier. Each tomb was different. Some were grand, filled with broken statues and false doors. Some were little more than clay pits with painted lids and faded charms. But they all smelled the same. Old dust and dried resin, sweat and limestone, the faint rot of forgotten offerings. You learned how to move silently, how to feel for hollow walls, how to read old inscriptions to know what might lie behind the plaster. You started bringing your own tools, not too many. Just a chisel, a knife, a coil of rope. Nothing that made noise. You stopped telling your wife where you were going at night. She stopped asking. And then came the day that changed everything. You heard about a tomb deeper in the valley, not in the official maps. A royal tomb, half collapsed during construction and abandoned. No one had touched it in decades. But a stonecutter you trusted swore his uncle had seen its shaft before it was sealed by a landslide. The rumor was that the burial had happened anyway, that a lesser prince had been entombed there in secret during a time of political unrest. It sounded foolish, dangerous, but also possible. You waited 3 weeks. You watched the patrols. You bribed a guard to look the other way. And finally, you slipped through the rocks at dusk, torch in hand, and followed the ancient slope. The shaft was real, and so was the tomb. What lay inside was stranger than anything you'd seen before. A low ceiling, carved with stars. A floor paved with images of the sky goddess Nut, her arms stretching from wall to wall. The sarcophagus was untouched, but cracked. The offerings had not been disturbed, at least not by men. The chamber felt wrong. It smelled of mold and sweetness, like flowers left too long in a closed room. Your breath came shallow. You reached out, and the air itself pushed back. Still, you stayed. You worked in silence. No partner this time. Just you and the darkness. You opened the offering boxes first. Jars of dried figs, blackened. A roll of papyrus, too brittle to touch. A statue of Anubis with one eye missing. You hesitated at the sarcophagus. It was sealed, but poorly. The lid had shifted. Whoever had buried the prince must have rushed. And then, a sound. Not a noise, exactly, but a feeling. As if the walls themselves had tensed. You froze. Your torch flickered. Then it went out. Complete blackness. You held your breath for what felt like hours. Nothing moved. When you lit the torch again, everything was as it had been. But you didn't finish the job. You turned and left, slowly, carefully. You whispered apologies again. You left the tomb with its dead. You told no one where you'd been. And the curse? It didn't come the way you expected. It wasn't a falling stone. It wasn't a wasting illness dot. It was smaller, colder. Your wife stopped speaking to you one night with no explanation. Your son, the eldest, vanished into military service and never wrote. Your fingers began to stiffen, not with injury, but with something deeper, something permanent. And your dreams, they changed. You began to see the tomb again, each night, but not as it was, as it should have been, lit, alive, a burial in motion, priests chanting, incense rising, and always the same face, not angry, not sad, just waiting, waiting for you to come back. Papyrus, punishment, and the long silence of justice. There's a moment when you hear your name spoken by a voice. That's not a friend, not family, not anyone who should know you. A voice that echoes from behind a wall or across a crowd when your chest forgets how to breathe. You were in the back room of a grain store when it happened. The old scribe who handled your debts looked up from a worn piece of papyrus and said flatly, "There's a summons for you." You asked, "For what?" He didn't answer. He just tapped the scroll. From Thebes, Temple Court, your name is listed. And that was that. It had been 3 years since the sealed tomb. You hadn't gone back. You hadn't touched another offering. You hadn't spoken a word about it to anyone. You had even stopped speaking to Kenny, your former partner, after a disagreement about how far things had gone. You thought the past had receded. You thought the dust had buried your mistakes. But things don't stay buried in Egypt. Not forever. They came for you at night. Not with a mob, not with violence, but with quiet sandals and long shadows. 2 officials dressed in simple linen. No weapons. They didn't need them. You knew what it meant when they stepped through your door and asked, gently, if you'd come with them. You didn't ask questions. You didn't cry out. You just nodded. Your wife said nothing. She sat by the hearth, holding a bowl that had long gone cold. They let you bring your sandals. Nothing else. The boat ride upriver was slow, silent. The guards didn't speak. They didn't need to. You watched the banks drift past, reed huts, fields of emmer wheat, narrow paths worn smooth by centuries of bare feet. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. You'd passed this stretch of river dozens of times before, delivering documents, traveling for temple audits. But now, you watched with a numb understanding that you weren't passing through it anymore. You were being returned to it, not as a man with duties, but as a man with debts. The courthouse wasn't what you expected. No massive columns, no golden thrones, just a low hall with faded inscriptions and cracked benches. The roof sagged slightly at one end. A jackal carved into the stone above the door watched you without judgment. There were no crowds, just scribes, officials, and the god statues watching from their niches. The trial was not dramatic. It was slow, methodical, boring even. It began with a list of accusations, read aloud by a priest with a voice like dust. You are named in the testimony of Henu, grain recorder, in connection with the illegal opening of the tomb of the Sem-priest Renku, year 9 of the pharaoh's reign. You didn't know Henu, but you remembered the tomb. More names followed, more tombs, more years. Some you recognized, others you didn't. Your hands stayed in your lap. You didn't move. You barely breathed. There were witnesses. One of them was Kenny. He didn't look at you as he spoke. He described how you'd found the entrance together, how you'd pried loose the clay seal, how you'd taken the scarab necklace, and he, only he, had returned it later after regret. You wanted to shout. You wanted to say, "He lied. He kept the necklace. I left it there," but you said nothing. Because in that moment, it didn't matter. Truth didn't live in these rooms anymore. Only procedure. They read from tablets. They asked you questions, not about what you had done, but about what you had meant to do. Did you intend to rob the tomb of a holy man? Did you intend to desecrate the seal of Anubis? Did you intend to dishonor your station? You didn't know how to answer. No would be a lie. Yes would be worse. So you said, "I was hungry." It wasn't enough. The court scribes recorded everything, their styluses scratching rhythmically on palm fiber scrolls. Your shame. Copied for eternity. They would archive it in the temple library, along with tax receipts and livestock births. And long after your bones were dust, someone would read your name and shake their head. The punishment wasn't execution. It was exile, marked labor, public confession, all written and read aloud. They made you recite your confession standing, arms outstretched, in front of a wall of stone gods. They placed a scribe beside you, in case you forgot the words. You spoke slowly, carefully. I, Menhai, once a scribe, have committed offense against the gods and the blessed dead. I have disturbed the peace of the tomb. I have violated the law. May the gods forgive me. The air didn't change. The gods didn't answer. But the room felt colder after. They shaved your head, gave you a branded necklace with your punishment etched in bone. And then they sent you to a labor crew far south of the city, not building, but cleaning, scrubbing limestone for temple restoration projects. Not an honor, but not the worst fate either. You didn't fight it. You didn't protest. You just accepted. Because something in you had already collapsed long before the verdict was ever read. The work was hard, dull. You used reed brushes to clear soot from old wall paintings. You washed the feet of statues, worn faceless by time. You whispered prayers as you did it, not to be heard, but out of habit. Your fingers cracked and bled. You didn't mind. Other men on the crew had similar stories. One had stolen bread from an offering table. One had forged grain weights. One had abandoned his post during the flooding season. None were monsters, just poor, tired, trapped. At night, you slept on a reed mat beneath a broken lintel. The wind howled through the stone around you. You sometimes dreamed of the tomb again, but not the moment you robbed it. No, you dreamed of walking back into it with a fresh offering, a jar of oil, a loaf of bread. You placed it gently at the foot of the sarcophagus and whispered, "I'm sorry." In the dream, the chamber always accepted it. In the real world, there was no such absolution. Months passed. The labor continued. Your hands grew slower. Your knees ached. Your memory frayed. Sometimes you would forget what year it was. Sometimes you would wake up and call out your son's name, only to remember he never wrote. He never came back. But there was one moment near the end when something shifted. You were sent to clean the outer stones of a lesser temple, half collapsed. The overseer gave you a broken brush and no instructions. You wandered until you found a quiet corner, a shattered relief of the god Pata, half buried under soot and time. You knelt Dot, and with one hand, you began to clean Dot slowly, gently, stroke by stroke. And as the image emerged, not perfectly, but enough, you felt something loosen in your chest. Not forgiveness, not hope, just space. Space to breathe, to exist, even in punishment, even in shame. The overseer walked by hours later. He didn't speak. He just nodded. And for the first time in a long time, you felt seen. You would never return home. Your name was stained. Your wife had moved on. Your old neighbors whispered when your name came up. But that didn't matter now. You had found something else. You had found stillness. And in that stillness, maybe, there was something like peace. Not redemption, not glory, but a kind of rest. And for a man like you, that was enough. There were curses written on tomb walls. Yes, but they didn't look like what most people imagine. There were no violent threats carved in blood or promises of monsters in the dark. They were quieter than that, more ritual, more warning than vengeance. The words were often polite, almost formulaic. He who disturbs this tomb, may he not receive offerings. May his name be forgotten. May his heart not be weighed favorably. For the ancient Egyptians, this wasn't poetic. This was terror. Because what mattered most wasn't the body, or even the wealth, but the memory, the name. To be remembered was to live again, in some way, to continue participating in the world of the living through their speech and offerings and stories. A curse that called for your name to be erased was worse than death. It was non-existence. So when you crawled into a tomb and saw a painted inscription along the plastered doorway that read, "May his enemies fall in darkness and be blind to Reaz's light," you didn't read it like a threat. You felt it like a weight. The stone seemed heavier. The air seemed stiller. And somewhere inside you, even if you were hungry, even if you were desperate, a part of you hesitated. That's how it worked. That's how the curse got in. Not through spells, but through belief. The belief that the dead had power, that the rituals had force, that the world of the seen and the unseen wasn't separate, but layered like translucent cloth. And in the years you spent listening to those who had robbed tombs, or had helped those who had, or had only heard about it in whispers, you noticed the same pattern. Nobody ever felt lucky afterward. The coins didn't stretch. The days didn't grow easier. Some lost children to fever, or crops to drought, or simply fell into silence, a kind of spiritual thinning, like being slowly drained through the soles of the feet. And they never said the word curse aloud. That would make it real. They just nodded more, rubbed their wrists more often, looked over their shoulder in places where no one stood. And as time passed, the empire that had built those tombs began to decay, not in a sudden collapse, but in a soft, unraveling way, like old linen left out too long in the sun. The priests grew poorer, their prayers shorter. The Nile grew more unpredictable. Sand filled in the cracks of once grand causeways. And in that vacuum, the curses didn't disappear. They deepened. Because when the state fails to punish, belief steps in. When there are no guards at the tombs anymore, the gods become the guards. Or the ancestors, or something older. You once heard a story from a man who used to maintain the outer steps of a crumbling royal necropolis. He was just a mason, patching stairs. But he told you, one night over shared lentils, about a room that no one ever entered. Not because it was sealed, but because of what was drawn on the door. Not carved, drawn. A single eye, surrounded by looping symbols. He said he once saw a jackal limp past it and stop, staring at the doorway, unmoving for what felt like hours. Then it turned and ran. He never went near it again. No treasure was worth that feeling. You didn't laugh when he said it. You knew that feeling. The air that tightens. The skin that cools even when the torch burns hot. The sense that something is not just watching, but remembering. That's what a curse really is, isn't it? Memory turned inward. A sacred grudge. A recording of violation stored in the fabric of a space. In tomb inscriptions, the deceased often requested offerings with the line, an offering that the king gives. Not because the king would bring it, but because invoking royal authority made it real. The inverse worked the same way. To invoke divine punishment, you had to name it, describe it, make it present through words. The walls were spells. The paint was prayer. And by stepping into that space and taking something that wasn't yours, whether a necklace or a cup or a pinch of sacred resin, you didn't just take an object. You unbalanced something. You disrupted a conversation between the living and the dead, between ritual and time. The gods weren't always watching, but the architecture was. You felt that once, most clearly, in a tomb that was nearly empty, long since looted, its walls half collapsed, its floor littered with bat droppings and dry beetle husks. There was nothing left to steal, but you stepped inside anyway, just to see it. And on the far wall, mostly intact, was a painted scene of the weighing of the heart. That familiar judgment moment with a dead man. As heart is placed on one side of the scale and the feather of truth on the other. If it's too heavy, if it's full of lies or greed or cruelty, then the monster Amit waits beneath the scale to devour it. That part wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what had been added later. In charcoal, by someone who clearly hadn't been a trained artist, another figure had been scrawled standing off to the side, a hunched man, with lines drawn across his face like scars or wrinkles. Not part of the original painting, just added. Maybe by a robber, maybe by a priest, no one knew. But the figure's eyes were wide, terrified, as if watching the judgment unfold and knowing, somehow, that he didn't belong there. You stared at it for a long time. You couldn't look away. And that night, when you closed your eyes, you saw that same hunched man again. Not in the tomb, but in your doorway. Just standing, watching, never moving. It passed, of course. All dreams do. But the feeling lingered. Not guilt. Not fear. Just a question. What had you really taken? Was it ever the gold? Was it ever the amulet? Or was it something else? Something you couldn't return, even if you wanted to. The priests would say the balance must be restored, that offerings must be made, that prayers must be recited in the right order, with the right names, on the right days. But what if the curse was quieter than that? What if it wasn't divine punishment, but the soft undoing of your own sense of belonging? You, unanchored. You, adrift. In Egyptian belief, the soul had many parts, the Ka, the Ba, the Ak. One needed food. One needed freedom. One needed harmony with the divine. But what if yours became fractured? What if, by entering a tomb that was not yours, You scattered those pieces like sand in the wind. Could you ever gather them again? Or did the curse mean walking the rest of your life feeling just slightly out of place, like a door that won't close, like a name half remembered? The more you thought about it, the more you understood. The worst curses weren't loud. They didn't strike you down in daylight or send plagues to your children. They just loosened you from the world. And the world, in turn, stopped recognizing you. You became less visible, less held, until even the gods forgot where you were. And that was the part no one could reverse. No amulet could reattach what had been untethered. No coin could buy back your old name. And so, in the end, you lived with it, not as a sentence, but as a fact, the same way stone erodes. Quietly, completely. The priests lived behind doors you weren't allowed to open. Their rooms were cool, even in the height of summer. Their sandals soft from use, but never torn. Their fingers always clean, smelling faintly of oils pressed from myrrh and blue lotus. You saw them pass by sometimes on your way to the market, their robes white and almost translucent in the morning sun, the edges embroidered with careful signs of rank. They didn't walk like common men. They drifted. You imagined the stone beneath their feet cooled for them alone. They were the keepers of memory, the ones who recited the names of kings even after the kings were gone. They knew the shape of the stars and the correct order of prayer. They woke before sunrise not to work, but to prepare rituals, mouth-opening ceremonies, libations for statues, fresh offerings placed before painted doorways. You envied them, but not in a cruel way. You didn't want their power. You just wanted what surrounded them, the slowness of their movements, the air of certainty, the understanding that they belonged. When you were young, you thought maybe you could become one of them. You practiced the prayers. You studied the glyphs. But then the barley spoiled, and your uncle died, and the apprenticeship was given to someone else, someone whose father could afford a gift for the temple steward. That was how it always went. The line between the sacred and the ordinary was never drawn in stone. It was drawn in linen, in oil, in the smell of incense on a day you weren't invited. And yet you still believed. That was the strange part. Even when your hands were cracked from hauling buckets, even when your sandals broke and you walked across hot flagstones barefoot, you still whispered the morning prayer to Ra. You still turned your head at sunset toward the west and bowed, because faith, for you, wasn't about luxury. It was about rhythm, and rhythm was all you had left. The priests lived inside that rhythm, but they did not share it. Their temples had storerooms filled with dried fish and sweet wine, preserved fruits and cakes spiced with cinnamon brought from across the sea. While you chewed on old onions and sipped warm water, they dined on honeyed goose and pomegranate seeds spooned from golden bowls. While you stared at stone walls, they painted theirs with gold leaf and blue pigments ground from crushed lapis. Even their silences were better, serene, not weary. You often wondered if they ever felt the weight of the tombs they protected, if they ever hesitated, placing a seal across a burial chamber, wondering who might one day break it. But they didn't seem to. To them, the past was a ledger kept in perfect order, its pages turned with care. They knew the spells to guard the gates, the correct number of steps in a funeral procession, the exact tone to use when calling on Thoth to bless the tomb. They knew which days were favorable for burial and which were not. And when you were caught, when you stood in that low hall of cracked limestone and were forced to speak your name, your crime, your shame, it was a priest who recorded it, not with anger, not even with disgust, just duty. He dipped his reed pen in ink and noted your sentence like it was a price of grain. And when you passed him days later in the courtyard, cleaning ash from the feet of a jackal statue, he didn't look away. He just looked through you. You didn't exist anymore in his world. You had been entered into the record, categorized, complete. You were part of the system now, the shadow side of the ritual, the necessary darkness that proved the light. But sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, when the temple was still and the wind curled around the pylons like an old breath, you wondered what they carried. The priests, the scribes, the officials who never touched the dead but named them every day. You saw one once, alone in a side chamber, sitting before a statue of Osiris, long after the last offering had been placed. His hands rested in his lap, still not praying, just sitting, as if listening, as if waiting for something no one else could hear. You didn't interrupt. You backed away, slowly, respectfully, and it stayed with you, that image. The holy man not as a guide, but as a mourner, as someone who knew, deep down, that none of this could last. Not the paint, not the spells, not the names, not even the gods themselves perhaps. Just the memory, the rhythm. And maybe, in that moment, the line between you and him wasn't so sharp after all. You both lived in the same land, walked the same halls, breathed the same hot, dust-scented air. You were both trying, in your own faltering ways, to keep something from falling apart. And though he had perfume and you had sweat, though he walked in ceremony and you walked in silence, though his chambers were cool and yours were not, you both stood before the same tombs. One sealing, one unsealing, but both listening. Listening for an answer that never quite came. What we still don't understand about Egyptian engineering, the stones do not speak, but they remember. That's what you start to understand, slowly, as the days stretch across the dust and your hands grow numb from rubbing limestone grit across the face of something older than your entire lineage. The more time you spend near these monuments, the pyramids, the temples, the shafts carved deep into bedrock where sunlight can reach, the more you stop thinking of them as built objects and start sensing them as moods. The air changes near them, not with magic, not with the hush of a conspiracy theory, but with the simple gravity of effort, the countless hands that lifted, dragged, cut, aligned, polished, without machines, without blueprints, without even, sometimes, a written name. And though we say we've solved it, that the stones were dragged on sleds over wet sand or hoisted on copper tools through clever ramps and brute repetition, there is still something left unsaid, something unsettled. Not a lack of knowledge, but a lack of presence. Because when you stand near the Great Pyramid, for example, not reading a plaque or taking a photograph, but really standing, just breathing, there's a strange quiet that sinks into your chest. The blocks are enormous, not incomprehensible, but more stubborn than you expected. The kind of stubborn that comes from labor so sustained, it warps the idea of time. You start to imagine the rhythm of the work. The sun rising on one layer, setting on another, the marks left on hands. The arguments between overseers, the way a chisel might dull by mid-morning. These stones aren't mysterious because they re-impossible. They re-mysterious because they were done at all. By people who knew they wouldn't be remembered by people whose bones are now dust under the very platforms they shaped. And yet, the alignment is perfect. The cardinal directions marked not just in compass points, but in shadow, in silence. The corners still right-angled after millennia. The base almost level, as if measured by instruments we wouldn't invent for centuries. And this isn't just true of the pyramids. Walk deeper into the temple complexes, Luxor, Karnak, Edfu, and you find columns so tall they disappear into the shadows above. Their tops carved with flowering papyrus and bound reeds, frozen mid-bloom. The scale is humbling. Not because it's large, but because it feels intentional. The weight of stone pressed downward like an idea, not just a ceiling. And there, along the walls, you'll see the little notches, cut marks, mason's lines, traces of rope, and adjustment and revision. Human marks, fallible, practical, and yet the result. Still standing, still aligned to stars, still whispering names in a language no longer spoken. You begin to wonder what tools they used, but more than that, what patience. The copper chisels would have dulled after hours. The dolerite pounding stones chipped and shattered. The ramps must have crumbled and been rebuilt over and over. And the logistics, feeding the workers, housing them, organizing their shifts, were as complex as the engineering itself. But none of this explains the feeling that these places weren't just built to last, but to outlast. Not just time, but memory, as if part of their function was to wait for the world to slow down again, to notice them not as monuments, but as messages. And maybe that's why, centuries later, you find yourself returning to them, not to solve them, but to sit beside them. As a repairman, you're not even working on the real thing most of the time. You're working on the damage, the cracks, the fallen casing stones, the weather-worn hieroglyphs on the outer walls. You patch, realign, reseal. You match pigments to faded murals that no longer shine. And even in that, there's a kind of reverence, because it means someone noticed, someone tried to preserve. But still, questions whisper. How did they move the obelisks, single pieces of granite weighing hundreds of tons, dragged from Aswan and stood upright with no cranes, no pulleys, just sand and muscle and ritual? How did they carve such straight lines through basalt? How did they match stones so tightly that even now, no blade fits between them? You've seen joints in stonework so precise, they almost feel soft to the touch, the corners warm, but still true. And some of them cut into bedrock with no tool marks at all. Others lined in niches that serve no clear purpose. Were they ceremonial? Acoustic? Cooling mechanisms? The deeper you go, the more the answers turn into mirrors, reflecting your own assumptions. Maybe that's the point. Maybe these weren't puzzles to be solved, but invitations to humility. Even the tombs, the deep, multi-chambered royal tombs carved into the Valley of the Kings, feel engineered less for grandeur and more for continuity. The corridors descend in perfect gradients. The walls follow the contours of the rock. The paint clings stubbornly to surfaces that haven't seen natural light in centuries. And always, above the sarcophagus, the same figures. Nut, the sky goddess, arching overhead. Ra in his solar boat. Osiris standing with crook and flail. But they aren't just art. They're guides, ritual blueprints. And the people who placed them knew that long after the priests were gone, long after the offerings stopped, these symbols would still echo. That's engineering too. Not just of stone, but of time. And then there's the matter of scale. It's one thing to build a mastaba or a shrine. It's another to carve a causeway half a mile long, paved with limestone, with drainage channels still functional. Or to cut a shaft straight down through bedrock until it reaches an untouched chamber, and then cover that entrance with layers of decoy paths, all to hide what's below. You begin to realize that ancient Egyptian engineering wasn't just practical, it was narrative. Every structure told a story, and that story was layered in geometry, astronomy, ritual, and function. You once worked near an unfinished tomb that still had the chisel marks on its walls, raw, erratic, abandoned mid-stroke. It was quiet there, even for the valley. And you could see, in the unpolished stone, a kind of pause, as if the workers had stopped not from fatigue, but from instruction. Maybe the owner had died. Maybe the dynasty shifted. Maybe someone ran out of money. But the story remained, half-written in rock. And as you walked through it, with your torch hissing in the damp air, you felt like you were inside someone's interrupted thought. That, too, is part of the mystery. The unfinished, the unanswered. The sense that the past isn't a solved equation, but a long pause still echoing. The ancients may not have had our tools, but they had something else, something we forget, continuity. The son of a stonecutter became a stonecutter. The grandson, too. Techniques weren't documented, they were demonstrated. whispered, memorized in motion. What was lost wasn't just knowledge, but rhythm. And now, centuries later, we're trying to reverse engineer the quiet, to understand not just how they did it, but how they thought it should feel. Because the truth is, the mystery isn't the monument, it's the mindset, the patience, the decision to build for the dead with more care than we often build for the living. And when you brush away the sand, and the old patterns re-emerge, and the air stirs slightly, as if exhaling something it has held for millennia, you don't ask how anymore. You just listen. The pyramid is already broken when you arrive. By the time you get there, the damage is already done. Not by thieves or earthquakes or sudden collapse, but by time. The real kind, the kind that doesn't break things all at once, but wears them down the way a whisper wears down a promise. You arrive not with grand purpose or ceremony, but with a small basket of tools, a folded cloth, maybe a pot of pigment if the overseer thinks. This section is worth preserving. And you walk up the side of a monument that is no longer sharp, no longer white, no longer holy to anyone except the dust that never leaves. You are not building anything. You are trying to stop the collapse from going further. That is your job. You are not the master builder praised in stone. You are the one who fills the cracks between the glory. And no one praises you. No one remembers your name. The pyramid is already broken when you arrive, and so is the temple wall, the granite statue, the lintel meant to hold up something heavier than itself. The joints have spread. The mortar has powdered into nothing. The plaster crumbles when you touch it, and you learn quickly to stop touching too much. Everything you do is small. One brush stroke, one resin mix, one smooth patch of ochre where a god's arm used to be. The man next to you doesn't talk, and you don't either, because there's nothing to say. It's not sacred, not anymore. Just work. And yet, you feel it. That soft pressure in the chest when your hand moves across a line someone carved 3,000 years before, not knowing you would be the one to rescue it from the wind. You clean it anyway, not because anyone will see it, but because it's still there. Because if someone once thought it worth carving, it must be worth saving. The pyramid is already broken when you arrive, and you don't fix it. You don't know how to lift a block the size of a house, and even if you did, the ramps are gone, the men are gone, the ropes and songs and scribes who once measured every angle have all gone back into the soil. You are here with a jar of clay and a pair of sore knees. You fix the small things, the shift in weight at a corner, the worn edge of a causeway step, the line of black where soot has stained an offering basin. And the deeper you go, into the shafts, the corridors, the lower chambers that still smell of resin and salt and damp stone, the more it becomes clear that you are not here to preserve something pristine. You are here to preserve something wounded. The pyramid is already broken when you arrive, but it breathes. Not with air, but with memory. You feel it in the way light curves across the wall near midday, hitting the same square of faded paint as it did last year, and the year before that, and probably 2,000 years before you were born. You feel it when your brush pulls away a layer of fine dirt and reveals a line of blue, still vivid, still alive, as if the sky had tucked itself into the wall for safekeeping. And sometimes you forget the outside world entirely. You forget that there are markets and wives and floods and kings. You forget your own name because it doesn't matter here. What matters is the gap in the joint, the line of wear on the base, the drip of water from somewhere above that shouldn't be there but is. And when you do speak to another repairman, to a passing priest, to the stone itself, it's soft, slow, the way you'd speak to someone just waking from a long sleep. The pyramid is already broken when you arrive, and you work under its shadow like a man sweeping the floor after a wedding that ended long ago. You find fragments, a chipped bead, a broken glyph, a foot where a god once stood, and you try to piece them together, not to restore, but to remember. And even that's a kind of building. You build backwards. You build in reverse. You build by refusing to let the last piece disappear. The men who once moved these stones are long gone. Their names, if written, are buried. Their bones, if preserved, have crumbled. But sometimes, in the quiet, you feel them. Not as ghosts, but as echoes in the way the work settles into your spine. They stood where you stand. They watched the light change as you do. They cursed the heat, the weight, the ache in the wrists. They had no idea that centuries later you would be here, smoothing the same surfaces. And yet, somehow, the work reached you. The pyramid is already broken when you arrive, and some days you wonder why you came at all. You could have worked in the granaries. You could have hauled fish from the Nile. You could have stood on a city wall with a spear and stared out at the desert, like so many others. But you came here. And even if it breaks you in small, invisible ways, even if your back bends before the year ends, even if your lungs fill with dust that never leaves, you stay. Not because it's glorious, but because it's quiet. Because the stone does not lie. Because the lines on the wall do not change. You work without audience, without reward, without the satisfaction of seeing the final result, because there is no final result. Only erosion delayed. Collapse held at bay for one more season. The pyramid is already broken when you arrive, and so are you, in a way. Broken by years of debt, by family pressure, by the slow narrowing of options. But here, inside this shell of history, you feel like part of something larger than yourself. Not sacred, not divine, just held. Like the wall holds the paint, like the stone holds the sun. You place your fingers against the crack, smooth the mixture, whisper the words the overseer taught you. May this line remain. May this peace persist. May this silence not be the end. And it is in this quiet, this complete quiet, that you start to hear other things, not voices, just the breathing of the place. The way a crack creaks slightly in the morning warmth, the way wind hums faintly in the upper vents of the mortuary passage, the way sand slides against stone without anyone touching it. You begin to move more gently. You set your tools down slower. You no longer whistle as you work. It's not reverence, exactly. It's resonance. Like tuning yourself to the tone of a place that's older than language. Sometimes in the late part of the day, you sit on the edge of a platform and look out over the stones, scattered fallen cut and half buried resting in the sun, like memories that no longer need to be remembered. You look down and see a footprint left in the mortar, not yours, but someone's from another time, pressed in accidentally and never smoothed out. You stare at it for a long time. You don't know why it stayed. You don't know why it moves you, but you imagine the person who left it. Were they tired? Were they young? Did they laugh when it happened, or curse, or not notice at all? That footprint is all that's left of their day, and now it's part of yours. The pyramid is already broken when you arrive, and what you learn is that everything breaks. Even the gods crack, their arms chipped, their headdresses gone. Even the sacred animals rot. Even the carved prayers fade until you no longer sure if that was a feather or a flame. And yet, nothing is truly gone. You carry it with you. You carry the blue of the sky in your memory. You carry the curve of the wall in your wrist. You carry the quiet in your bones, and when you leave, when your time ends as all time does, someone else will arrive with a basket of tools and tired eyes, and they will continue what you began. Not because it will be finished, but because it matters that it continues. Dust settles where names disappear. The stone doesn't care who you are. That's something you learn slowly, not from books or orders, but from watching the way dust coats every surface evenly, whether it's the face of a forgotten laborer carved on a low corner wall, or the stern brow of a god once bathed in incense. There's no favoritism here, no preserving fame over obscurity. Time makes no distinction. And as a repairman, someone who comes not to build or bless, but to mend and sweep and shore up what others have left behind, you start to feel that flattening of identity seep into you too. You don't matter here, not really. Not as an individual. You're just the next hand to touch this crack, the next pair of feet to echo down this long corridor beneath the sand. You used to think about legacy, about learning the names of those who came before you, Imhotep or those other great stone men whose works still stand above ground. But now you find yourself more drawn to the unknowns, to the half-carved name on the rear side of a pillar, to the little markings no one bothered to finish, to the wrong strokes chipped out and left imperfect. You wonder who those belong to, not the high priests or engineers, but the boy who mixed the plaster, the girl who hauled water in the early dawn, the man who trimmed a chisel until it was too short to hold. There are stories there too, though no one wrote them down. And in the silence of the repair chambers, where old tools lie rusted beside, cracked amphorae where lizards dart through discarded headdresses, and the only sound is your own breath catching on stone dust, you can almost hear them. You see, the pyramid is grand from a distance, but inside, it's a space of errors. A chipped stair, a wall where a layer of paint never dried properly, stones that don't fit quite flush because someone mismeasured 1,000 years ago and there was no time to redo it. You aren't correcting those flaws. You're inheriting them, working around them, preserving their mistakes too, because they are part of the thing now. And that makes you think at odd hours about how little permanence matters, how names fade and purposes shift, but what endures are the things no one notices. A groove worn smooth by 100 hands. A doorway that leans slightly because it was always uneven. You sweep it anyway. You place your tools in a line, not because anyone is watching, but because the ritual helps you remember that the work still matters. You patch a crack near the statue base, and your thumb comes away red from pigment or blood. You don't know. It doesn't sting. Everything here happens slowly. There's a spider web across the face of a once great pharaoh, and you don't brush it away. You leave it there because it feels true. It feels more honest than polishing it for a royal inspector who no longer exists. At midday, you step outside, and the wind is dry and blinding. You look out across the valley, not the one tourists visit, but the one only workers know, where the storage huts lean and the bones of animals lie clean in the sand. You chew something bitter and sip from your clay jar, then return. Inside, it's cooler, always still. You kneel. You reach into the box where you keep old fragments, a bead, a cracked stone, a rolled piece of linen that once wrapped a child king. You don't know what to do with it, but you can't throw it away. No one told you to keep it. You just can't discard it. It feels like a piece of something sacred, even if it's not beautiful, even if it no longer fits anywhere. The names disappear, but the dust remains. The dust is memory now. It's layered, one age over another, falling soft, patient, equal. It clings to your skin and settles into the folds of your robe. You stop brushing it off. You let it settle. You let it claim you, slowly, as it has claimed everything else. And in time, even the act of work begins to change. You move slower, not because you are lazy, but because the stillness around you demands it. A fast hand here is a foolish hand. Things crack when hurried. And here, in this place of layered silence, there is no urgency. You learn to measure your breath with the rhythm of your sweeping. You learn to let your thoughts pass through you, like the sun through the high vents, slowly, without weight. Some days, you don't repair anything at all. You just observe. You trace the edges of faded figures with your eye. You press your palm to a slab and feel the uneven cold. You listen. And in that listening, you sometimes hear more than you expect. A shift in the stone, a grain falling inside a crack, a memory not yours. You imagine the man who once sealed this wall, who once poured resin into a joint and whispered a prayer. You imagine the woman who painted the bird glyphs and forgot one feather but didn't go back. Their hands live in the pigment. Their breath is still here. You are not alone in your work, even if your name will be lost like theirs. Even if you are nothing more than a breath between the lines. Sometimes a visitor comes, a noble, or a priest with an entourage, or a curious boy brought by an elder, and they ask you what you do. They stand in the light and squint down the long, dry corridor, and they point to a section where you've patched over something too delicate to explain. They say, "Why fix what's already fallen?" And you have no answer. Or rather, you have many, but none they would understand. You shrug. You say, "It matters," and you return to your tools. The visitor leaves, and you remain. You always remain. You sweep and wipe and press resin into the joints of the past. And when the sun goes down and the sky turns iron gray and the tomb is still, you feel something lift, a kind of release, not traumatic, but patient, like a sigh through stone. The names disappear, but the care lingers. You are not here to be remembered. You are here so something else might be. And that is enough. The day begins far from the dusty corridors, where the repairmen toil, in chambers adorned with painted walls and scents carried gently on perfumed air. Here, the priests awaken beneath linen canopies, their sleep protected by the cool stone and the careful hands of attendants who move silently, stirring water into fragrant oils. The priests' lives revolve around maintaining the invisible threads that bind the earthly realm to the gods, performing rites that are as old as the stones themselves. The priests gather in small groups, their voices lowered to hushed tones as they discuss matters that ripple far beyond these painted walls. The priests retreat to private quarters or meditate alone by small altars, their thoughts drifting between the mortal world and the divine. Outside, the desert wind picks up, carrying with it the distant sounds of nocturnal creatures stirring among the rocks and sand. But within these walls, a stillness reigns, profound and almost sacred. The lamps flicker low, casting soft pools of light over intricate carvings and richly painted scenes that tell stories of gods, kings, and the eternal struggle between chaos and order. You might imagine running your fingers over these cool, worn surfaces, feeling the texture of ancient paint and the unevenness left by centuries of touch. This is a world where history is alive, not in books or scrolls, but in the very stones themselves, whispering secrets to those patient enough to listen. In the quiet moments before sleep, the priests reflect on their roles, guardians of sacred knowledge, intermediaries between heaven and earth, keepers of rituals that ensure the balance of the cosmos. Their lives are a blend of devotion, power, and isolation, marked by moments of profound beauty and a steady undercurrent of burden. You sense that their comfort is tinged with loneliness, their privilege shadowed by the weight of expectation and the slow march of time. As the night deepens, you imagine the soft rustle of linen robes, the gentle breathing of those who have dedicated themselves to a purpose larger than any single life. Outside, the stars wheel slowly overhead, indifferent to the fortunes and struggles below. The pyramid, silent and vast, watches over the land as it always has, its stones cool beneath the moonlight, cradling the memory of all who have touched it, from the greatest pharaoh to the humblest repairman. And as you close your eyes, you feel the pulse of history beneath your skin, the steady heartbeat of a world that moves slowly, patiently, through the endless cycles of decay and renewal. This life, so far removed from the harsh toil of the pyramid's cracks, is no less demanding, no less real. It is a quiet kind of grandeur, a calm persistence that carries on long after the dust has settled and the names have faded. And in that calm, you find a strange kind of peace. Here, decisions are made about offerings, temple finances, and the allocation of laborers, many of whom you know are the same hands that repair the pyramid. silent cracks. Their robes flow softly as they move through the halls, their sandals barely making a sound on the polished floors, their presence a reminder of the delicate balance between the mortal and the divine. Outside, the sun beats down mercilessly on the desert sands, but within these walls, the air remains cool and still, carrying the scent of lotus, myrrh, and old wood. The priests drink from goblets of wine sweetened with dates, their conversations winding through sacred and secular matters alike, touching on the fates of kings and commoners without distinction. It's a life of contrast, of opulence shadowed by solemn duty, of privilege tempered by ritual discipline. You might picture the intricate patterns woven into their linen tunics, the delicate jewelry that glints in the dim light, the faint lines of age and care etched on faces that have seen decades of temple life. These are people who walk a narrow path, caught between the gods' expectations and the practical realities of their world. And yet, despite the power they wield, there is a palpable sense of weariness, a slow, persistent weight that settles on shoulders burdened by centuries of tradition. You imagine the soft sounds of scrolls unfurling, the careful hands of scribes tracing hieroglyphs with steady brushes, preserving knowledge that must never be lost. Outside these chambers, life goes on. Markets bustle with merchants selling spices, textiles, and tools. Children play in dusty courtyards. Laborers rest in the shade between shifts. But here, within the sanctuary of painted walls, time bends differently. It stretches and contracts with the rhythm of prayers and offerings, of whispered secrets and silent hopes. This is a life that few see and fewer understand. A world apart from the dust and sweat of the pyramid repairers, yet inextricably linked to the fate of the stone itself. As afternoon fades to evening, the chamber fills with the gentle glow of oil lamps, their flickering light casting long shadows and illuminating faces that are both proud and haunted. You feel the quiet pulse of a place steeped in history, a place where every stone, every brushstroke, carries the weight of generations. You can almost hear the murmured incantations slipping through the air, like a gentle wind weaving through the columns, touching each surface with reverence. The smells shift now, blending the heady aroma of frankincense with the sharper, sweeter tongue of fresh lotus blossoms brought in from the river's edge. Outside, the city carries on, its dust swirling in the sunlight, but inside, the world feels contained, deliberate, held in a timeless embrace. The high priest steps forward, his hands raised in offering, his voice steady and measured, reciting prayers that have been uttered countless times before, but never lose their solemn weight. Servants move quietly, lighting lamps to chase away the growing shadows, placing fresh water bowls for the ritual washings, arranging offerings of bread and wine on altars carved with intricate hieroglyphs. You might imagine the tactile sensation of these ancient stone surfaces beneath your fingers. Cool, smooth, worn in places by the touch of generations of worshippers. Meals in this world are not hurried affairs, but moments of contemplation and gratitude. The finest honey is drizzled slowly over soft cakes, while figs and pomegranates are carefully selected for their ripeness and sweetness. Each bite is savored, not merely for nourishment, but as an extension of the sacred cycle, a reminder of the gifts of the earth and the blessings of the gods. The light shifts again, lengthening the shadows and painting the walls with deep golds and soft ambers, as the priests prepare for the mid-morning rites. Their movements are slow and precise, their voices rising and falling in the melodic cadence of ritual song. Outside, the murmur of the city dims, swallowed by the growing heat of the day. But within these chambers, the pulse of tradition beats strong and steady. You feel a curious calm settle over you as you imagine yourself here, walking softly across the stone floor, smelling the mingled scents, hearing the faint echoes of voices long past but never gone. This is a world where power is woven through faith, where every gesture carries meaning, and where the comforts of luxury are inseparable from the weight of responsibility. Outside, the sun climbs slowly, casting shafts of light through narrow windows, setting patterns of gold and shadow across the polished floors. The rich tapestry of ritual life unfolds not with haste, but with a measured grace, an ebb and flow that honors the gods and preserves a delicate balance between the divine and the mundane. You can almost hear the faint, soft murmur of chants rising from the inner sanctum, the voices steady and low, like a slow river winding through a deep valley, uninterrupted and continuous. This is a world apart from the grit and sweat of the laborers who mend the pyramid's cracks. Here, the air is thick with the scent of honeyed incense, mingled with hints of dry papyrus and the sharp sweetness of date wine. The priests' robes, rich with dyed fabrics, brush gently against the smooth stone as they move, their sandals whispering over the floors. Their fingers are careful, tending to sacred scrolls and relics, their hands steady from years of practice and respect. Meals are prepared with care, laden with figs, bread sweetened with honey, and tender cuts of duck, all served in delicate vessels that catch the light and sparkle like jewels. In this space, time itself seems to slow, as though the passage of days is measured not by the sun alone, but by the cycles of prayer, offering, and quiet reflection. Outside, servants move with practiced ease, carrying trays of food and water, setting tables, and attending to the smallest needs without interrupting the sacred flow. The high priests, draped in fine linen, sit in chambers painted with scenes of the gods, their faces calm and composed, their eyes reflecting the weight of responsibility and the privilege of proximity to the divine. These men and women live lives that are both deeply public and fiercely private, their deeds and words recorded in hieroglyphs meant to echo through eternity, yet their true thoughts known only to themselves and the gods they serve. This is a life of ritual precision, of endless repetition, where every gesture is both meaningful and rehearsed, and where the past and future converge in the present moment. Outside the temple walls, the city hums quietly, the market stalls opening, the sounds of animals stirring, the murmur of merchants and townsfolk. But within these chambers, the world narrows to a focus on the eternal, the sacred, the unchanging. You can imagine the feeling of walking here, the smoothness of the stones beneath your feet, the cool air carrying a faint whisper of the Nile and the distant desert. It is a life of comfort, yes, but also of restraint. The luxury is tempered by discipline. Every word spoken must be measured, every action considered. This is a place where power and faith intertwine, where the daily routine is a prayer, and where the fate of kings and gods alike is negotiated in silence and ceremony. As the morning light deepens, the chamber fills with subtle activity, the soft clink of golden cups, the rustle of silk robes, the faint scrape of papyrus as scribes prepare their records. As the day stretches on, the chambers become quieter, the rituals giving way to moments of private contemplation and subtle negotiation. As twilight deepens and the sky softens into dusky shades of purple and blue, the chambers begin to empty, leaving behind only the faintest traces of incense and the quiet echo of footsteps long gone. The day begins far from the dusty corridors, where the repairmen toil, in chambers adorned with painted walls and scents carried gently on perfumed air. Here, the priests awaken beneath linen canopies, their sleep protected by the cool stone and the careful hands of attendants who move silently, stirring water into fragrant oils. The priests' lives revolve around maintaining the invisible threads that bind the earthly realm to the gods, performing rites that are as old as the stones themselves. The priests gather in small groups, their voices lowered to hushed tones as they discuss matters that ripple far beyond these painted walls. The priests retreat to private quarters or meditate alone by small altars, their thoughts drifting between the mortal world and the divine. Outside, the desert wind picks up, carrying with it the distant sounds of nocturnal creatures stirring among the rocks and sand. But within these walls, a stillness reigns, profound and almost sacred. The lamps flicker low, casting soft pools of light over intricate carvings and richly painted scenes that tell stories of gods, kings, and the eternal struggle between chaos and order. You might imagine running your fingers over these cool, worn surfaces, feeling the texture of ancient paint and the unevenness left by centuries of touch. This is a world where history is alive, not in books or scrolls, but in the very stones themselves, whispering secrets to those patient enough to listen. In the quiet moments before sleep, the priests reflect on their roles, guardians of sacred knowledge, intermediaries between heaven and earth, keepers of rituals that ensure the balance of the cosmos. Their lives are a blend of devotion, power, and isolation, marked by moments of profound beauty and a steady undercurrent of burden. You sense that their comfort is tinged with loneliness, their privilege shadowed by the weight of expectation and the slow march of time. As the night deepens, you imagine the soft rustle of linen robes, the gentle breathing of those who have dedicated themselves to a purpose larger than any single life. Outside, the stars wheel slowly overhead, indifferent to the fortunes and struggles below. The pyramid, silent and vast, watches over the land as it always has, its stones cool beneath the moonlight, cradling the memory of all who have touched it, from the greatest pharaoh to the humblest repairman. And as you close your eyes, you feel the pulse of history beneath your skin, the steady heartbeat of a world that moves slowly, patiently, through the endless cycles of decay and renewal. This life, so far removed from the harsh toil of the pyramid's cracks, is no less demanding, no less real. It is a quiet kind of grandeur, a calm persistence that carries on long after the dust has settled and the names have faded. And in that calm, you find a strange kind of peace. Here, decisions are made about offerings, temple finances, and the allocation of laborers, many of whom you know are the same hands that repair the pyramid, silent cracks. Their robes flow softly as they move through the halls, their sandals barely making a sound on the polished floors, their presence a reminder of the delicate balance between the mortal and the divine. Outside, the sun beats down mercilessly on the desert sands, but within these walls, the air remains cool and still, carrying the scent of lotus, myrrh, and old wood. The priests drink from goblets of wine sweetened with dates, their conversations winding through sacred and secular matters alike, touching on the fates of kings and commoners without distinction. It's a life of contrast, of opulence shadowed by solemn duty, of privilege tempered by ritual discipline. You might picture the intricate patterns woven into their linen tunics, the delicate jewelry that glints in the dim light, the faint lines of age and care etched on faces that have seen decades of temple life. These are people who walk a narrow path, caught between the gods' expectations and the practical realities of their world. And yet, despite the power they wield, there is a palpable sense of weariness, a slow, persistent weight that settles on shoulders burdened by centuries of tradition. You imagine the soft sounds of scrolls unfurling, the careful hands of scribes tracing hieroglyphs with steady brushes, preserving knowledge that must never be lost. Outside these chambers, life goes on. Markets bustle with merchants selling spices, textiles, and tools. Children play in dusty courtyards. Laborers rest in the shade between shifts. But here, within the sanctuary of painted walls, time bends differently. It stretches and contracts with the rhythm of prayers and offerings, of whispered secrets and silent hopes. This is a life that few see and fewer understand. A world apart from the dust and sweat of the pyramid repairers, yet inextricably linked to the fate of the stone itself. As afternoon fades to evening, the chamber fills with the gentle glow of oil lamps, their flickering light casting long shadows and illuminating faces that are both proud and haunted. You feel the quiet pulse of a place steeped in history, a place where every stone, every brushstroke, carries the weight of generations. You can almost hear the murmured incantations slipping through the air, like a gentle wind weaving through the columns, touching each surface with reverence. The smells shift now, blending the heady aroma of frankincense with the sharper, sweeter tongue of fresh lotus blossoms brought in from the river's edge. Outside, the city carries on, its dust swirling in the sunlight. But inside, the world feels contained, deliberate, held in a timeless embrace. The high priest steps forward, his hands raised in offering, his voice steady and measured, reciting prayers that have been uttered countless times before, but never lose their solemn weight. Servants move quietly, lighting lamps to chase away the growing shadows, placing fresh water bowls for the ritual washings, arranging offerings of bread and wine on altars carved with intricate hieroglyphs. You might imagine the tactile sensation of these ancient stone surfaces beneath your fingers. Cool, smooth, worn in places by the touch of generations of worshippers. Meals in this world are not hurried affairs, but moments of contemplation and gratitude. The finest honey is drizzled slowly over soft cakes, while figs and pomegranates are carefully selected for their ripeness and sweetness. Each bite is savored, not merely for nourishment, but as an extension of the sacred cycle, a reminder of the gifts of the earth and the blessings of the gods. The light shifts again, lengthening the shadows and painting the walls with deep golds and soft ambers, as the priests prepare for the mid-morning rites. Their movements are slow and precise, their voices rising and falling in the melodic cadence of ritual song. Outside, the murmur of the city dims, swallowed by the growing heat of the day. But within these chambers, the pulse of tradition beats strong and steady. You feel a curious calm settle over you as you imagine yourself here, walking softly across the stone floor, smelling the mingled scents, hearing the faint echoes of voices long past but never gone. This is a world where power is woven through faith, where every gesture carries meaning, and where the comforts of luxury are inseparable from the weight of responsibility. Outside, the sun climbs slowly, casting shafts of light through narrow windows, setting patterns of gold and shadow across the polished floors. The rich tapestry of ritual life unfolds not with haste, but with a measured grace, an ebb and flow that honors the gods and preserves a delicate balance between the divine and the mundane. You can almost hear the faint, soft murmur of chants rising from the inner sanctum, the voices steady and low, like a slow river winding through a deep valley, uninterrupted and continuous. This is a world apart from the grit and sweat of the laborers who mend the pyramid's cracks. Here, the air is thick with the scent of honeyed incense, mingled with hints of dry papyrus and the sharp sweetness of date wine. The priests' robes, rich with dyed fabrics, brush gently against the smooth stone as they move, their sandals whispering over the floors. Their fingers are careful, tending to sacred scrolls and relics, their hands steady from years of practice and respect. Meals are prepared with care, laden with figs, bread sweetened with honey, and tender cuts of duck, all served in delicate vessels that catch the light and sparkle like jewels. In this space, time itself seems to slow, as though the passage of days is measured not by the sun alone, but by the cycles of prayer, offering, and quiet reflection. Outside, servants move with practiced ease, carrying trays of food and water, setting tables, and attending to the smallest needs without interrupting the sacred flow. The high priests, draped in fine linen, sit in chambers painted with scenes of the gods, their faces calm and composed, their eyes reflecting the weight of responsibility and the privilege of proximity to the divine. These men and women live lives that are both deeply public and fiercely private, their deeds and words recorded in hieroglyphs meant to echo through eternity, yet their true thoughts known only to themselves and the gods they serve. This is a life of ritual precision, of endless repetition, where every gesture is both meaningful and rehearsed, and where the past and future converge in the present moment. Outside the temple walls, the city hums quietly, the market stalls opening, the sounds of animals stirring, the murmur of merchants and townsfolk. But within these chambers, the world narrows to a focus on the eternal, the sacred, the unchanging. You can imagine the feeling of walking here, the smoothness of the stones beneath your feet, the cool air carrying a faint whisper of the Nile and the distant desert. It is a life of comfort, yes, but also of restraint. The luxury is tempered by discipline. Every word spoken must be measured, every action considered. This is a place where power and faith intertwine, where the daily routine is a prayer, and where the fate of kings and gods alike is negotiated in silence and ceremony. As the morning light deepens, the chamber fills with subtle activity. The soft clink of golden cups, the rustle of silk robes, the faint scrape of papyrus as scribes prepare their records. As the day stretches on, the chambers become quieter, the rituals giving way to moments of private contemplation and subtle negotiation. As twilight deepens and the sky softens into dusky shades of purple and blue, the chambers begin to empty, leaving behind only the faintest traces of incense and the quiet echo of footsteps long gone. The bishop's residence did not simply rise above the town in a literal sense. It existed in a different orbit altogether, one where velvet robes replaced rough-spun habits, and where the cold morning bells of convent discipline gave way to the soft clink of goblets and the murmured Latin of private mass. Here, inside walls heavy with tapestry and thick with smoke from braziers fed constantly through the winter months, the air was scented not with the musty damp of chapel stone or the herbal sting of none-kept infirmaries, but with imported, incense-clove-studded wine and roast meats, so rich their aroma seemed to kneel the kitchen boys with hunger. Imagine, if you will, coming from the echoing silence of an abbey where nuns walked, 2 by 2 in cold cloisters forbidden to speak and expected to smile at suffering, only to enter this parallel world where a bishop might receive both a courier and a gesture before the sun was fully risen. While the average monastic meal consisted of gruel and brown bread seasoned only with piety, the episcopal kitchen sent up layered pies, almond paste pastries, eels steeped in garlic butter, and whole capons glazed with honey and dusted with cinnamon. Servants moved like whispers behind drapes, and entire chambers were built simply to impress rooms not for prayer, but for performances of power. The bishop's table might host a visiting archdeacon one evening and a local lord the next, and between mouthfuls of meat and discussions of ecclesiastical land rights, the room might ring with a lute, or with laughter sharp enough to disturb the sleep of the more devout. His bedchamber, perhaps draped in imported textiles from Venice, contained a feather-stuffed mattress, an enormous carved crucifix above the headboard, and hidden discreetly in a traveling coffer of poems written in French. These were not for reading at Mass. While his sermons thundered with warnings of excess and pride, his scroll case held letters from noble women requesting his favor in lawsuits, or offering baskets of preserved pears in exchange for an annulment. This duality did not seem to trouble him much. To the bishop, the body and the soul could both be served, provided they remained compartmentalized. The palace itself had secret doorways, literal passages behind walls, used by pages or guests who were not meant to be seen arriving. There was always a candle burning somewhere, always a servant smoothing wrinkles from a hem, always a choir rehearsing in the lower chapel, their voices rising even as upstairs the bishop indulged in a different kind of harmony, political negotiation over plum brandy, or flirtation masked as theological debate. He was, after all, a man of letters. He quoted Augustine with one breath and requested another cushion with the next, while cloistered sisters worried over lice or confessed to dreams about the Virgin's suffering. Their bishop might be arranging his next hunting trip, complete with falconers and a borrowed steed from a neighboring count. If a nun's shoes were falling apart, she stitched them with salvaged thread and prayed the prior wouldn't notice. If the bishop's boots were worn, he ordered a fresh pear-soft leather lined with fleece, delivered by courier, embossed with his family crest. His coat of arms hung beside crucifixes, and though he did kneel, he did so on velvet cushions trimmed with gold. During Advent, while nuns wept in candlelit vigils and fasted until their knees shook, The bishop might sneak oysters in the evening and have the cooks prepare a second course, just for his guests. This dissonance wasn't lost on everyone. The more austere monks gnashed their teeth quietly, and the local poor watched processions of silken clergy with a mixture of awe and hunger. Yet no one dared speak openly, for to question the bishop's lifestyle was to question God's hierarchy, or worse, to question the church's purse strings. And the purse was vast. Collected tithes, monastery rents, land holdings, donations for imagined relics, all funneled upward, some to Rome, much to the bishop's accounts. He funded cathedral repairs, certainly, but also paintings of himself, kneeling beside saints he had never met. The irony glistened like candle wax in every chapel he rededicated. Still, it would be wrong to paint him entirely as a villain. He wept at funerals, truly. He blessed children and paid for a midwife when his steward's wife went into labor. He believed in some deep, complex way that his station was God-given, that his comfort was a reward for obedience, not a betrayal of it, that his fine foods, his layered garments, his private gardens, none of these were sins if he still remembered to kneel, still wrote his Easter sermon, still anointed the sick with trembling hands. And so the contrast persisted. At the same hour, a novice nun might be scrubbing the floor with freezing water, her fingers cracked and red from cold. The bishop might be standing before a warm fire, contemplating whether the relic of Saint Jerome he'd just acquired was real or just clever Roman pottery with a forged certificate. While sisters confessed to impure thoughts and were given bread and silence in return, the bishop might confess nothing at all, trusting that his confession was written into the very structure of his cathedral, into the chime of the bell tower he had paid to restore, into the eyes of the Madonna statue gazing down from above his high altar. He, too, prayed, just not always before meals. He, too, suffered. But often it was indigestion or the annoyance of Rome delaying a papal bull. And in this strange, holy imbalance, this world where one man's fast was another man's feast, the medieval church breathed, bloated and beautiful and broken, until the next reformer came along to call it out. But that was another sermon for another century. For now, the bishop dined, and the nuns dreamed. There's a peculiar silence that follows a feast. Not the hungry silence before, nor the noisy joy during, but the kind that settles in the aftermath, as candle wax pools on polished oak, and the air grows thick with the scent of roasted meat, honeyed wine, and the sweat of too many bodies confined under a timber-bird roof. In this hush, where even the hearth crackles softer, you might begin to notice things. How the bishop seated at the far end beneath, a painted crucifix, has not spoken in some time. How his gold-threaded robe has begun to slip from one shoulder. How the men beside him are waiting expectantly for a word, a glance, a signal. This, after all, is not just supper. In the bishop's hall, even a meal could be a performance, a courtly pageant where power danced in subtleties. Who was served first? Whose goblet was refilled before another's? Who dared speak above the hum of the clergy? And you, if you were a lowly cleric or a cousin of some minor baron invited for the first time, would be hyper-aware of the rules no one explained. Don't sit before he does. Don't touch the bread until the blessing. Don't speak unless spoken to. And for God's sake, don't reach across the table. In the upper echelons of the medieval church, where wealth and worship mixed uneasily, the feasting table was both altar and battlefield, a place where reputations were sharpened and ruined, where alliances were whispered between courses and enemies, watched each other's hands more than their eyes. The servants, of course, moved like ghosts quick, invisible, silent. Their feet knew the creaky floorboards to avoid. Their fingers danced across platters of boar and flagons of wine with the muscle memory of those born into a life of service. They heard things clergy muttering about land disputes, confessions spilled in drunken slips, veiled threats beneath flattery, and they forgot them just as quickly. To be a servant in the bishop's palace was to become part of the furniture, always present, yet never seen. Meanwhile, in the kitchens below, fire roared and dogs barked, and a girl with flour in her hair sobbed quietly over spilled broth, her hands raw from scrubbing pots too heavy for her frame. There was another world beneath the feast, just as there was another beyond the high walls, where villagers eyed the light from the windows and imagined the gluttony within, where starving children dreamed of crusts from the bishop's discarded trencher, and where rumors brewed like weak ale about what truly went on behind those doors. For the bishop was not merely a man of God. He was a landlord, a judge, a collector of tithes and debts. His banquets were paid for by the calloused hands of peasants, by the meager earnings of shepherds taxed beyond reason. Every slab of venison, every carved goose, bore the invisible stain of labor wrung from the land. And while the nobility toasted Latin prayers, while minstrels sang of saints in battle, while gold leaf gleamed on painted walls, a different kind of story unfolded outside, one of hunger, resentment, and a growing awareness that the bishop's gospel often served the bishop first. Yet within the palace, that awareness was dulled by spiced wine, by harp music, by the steady rhythm of courtly life. Ladies embroidered beside the fire, stitching lily and lambs into silk, while murmuring of pilgrimages they'd never take. A young scribe, too clever for his rank, secretly corrected his master's Latin under his breath and dreamed of Oxford. A knight, half drunk and bored, bragged about a boar hunt that had likely never happened. And still, at the table, the bishop remained quiet, his fingers resting on a goblet carved from horn, his eyes scanning faces with the measured patience of a man who knew that silence often spoke louder than sermons. These were the twilight hours of medieval comfort, gilded and hollow. For beyond the chapel walls, famine stirred. A failed harvest, a restless village, a reeve beaten in the woods for collecting rents. None of this was discussed over supper, of course. Instead, there was laughter at a crude joke, applause for the jongleurs tumbling, praise for the imported figs served on pewter plates. The illusion held. It always held until it didn't. And when it cracked quietly. A servant missing. A steward dismissed. A letter from Rome sealed in red wax and carried by a shivering boy who refused to meet anyone's eyes. It was in these small shifts, these murmurs in the corridors, that the real power moved unseen, unspoken, but present. The bishop knew this. He had built his career not on sermons, but on secrets, not on piety, but on politics. His feast was a mask, a carefully arranged tableau meant to impress visiting abbots and silence local lords. But beneath the music and the murmur, he listened. He always listened. To the tones of voices, to the hesitation before a name was spoken, to the silence after a toast. And when he finally stood, robes heavy with embroidery, and raised his hands in benediction, the room quieted not out of reverence, but out of fear. Fear of what he might say. Fear of what he might already know. The blessing was brief, perfunctory. The kind of thing learned by rote and recited with the cadence of someone who had once believed it and now used it like a tool. Plates were cleared. Torches sputtered. Guests bowed and made their excuses. And as they filed out into the cold stone halls, as the warmth of the feast faded into memory, one could almost forget the taste of the wine, the shimmer of the gold. What lingered instead was a question unspoken, but heavy. What did he see? What did he know? And tomorrow, who would pay for tonight's feast? The grand halls of the temple, bathed in the soft glow of flickering oil lamps, seem almost alive as the evening deepens and shadows stretch long across painted walls. Here, in chambers scented with myrrh and frankincense, the priests move with practiced grace robes, whispering over polished stone floors, hands steady as they arrange offerings of figs, honey, and roast goose on altars carved with sacred symbols. Their lives are steeped in ritual, every gesture carrying weight and meaning, passed down through generations. a dance of devotion and duty that separates them from the harsh dust and sweat of the pyramid workers outside. You can almost feel the cool stone beneath your fingertips, worn smooth by centuries of careful worship, and hear the soft murmur of chants rising and falling like a gentle tide. The contrast between their fragrant painted chambers and the bitter dryness of the workers' onions is a quiet testament to the vast gulf of privilege, one that touches not only what they eat, but how they live, breathe, and experience the world. As twilight fades into night, the scent of perfumed oils lingers in the air, mingling with the distant sounds of the Nile's flowing water and the soft rustle of palm fronds in a desert breeze. The priests' voices rise in unison, a steady rhythm that soothes and commands, binding past and present in a timeless thread. Outside, the workers lie beneath rough blankets, their bodies weary from hauling stone and mending cracks in the colossal monument to a forgotten king. Their dreams are quieter, filled with hopes for dawn, for rest for the day's end. Inside, the priests offer prayers not only for the pharaoh's eternal life, but for the balance of the cosmos itself, a weighty responsibility carried with solemn grace. The honeyed goose may fill their stomachs, but it is the rituals, the sacred words, the careful stewardship of tradition that truly nourish their souls. As the temple's lamps gutter low and the final chants fade into silence, a profound stillness settles over the chamber, a peace born of faith, duty, and the slow, enduring pulse of history. And as you listen, drifting in the quiet warmth of this ancient world, you too are invited to rest, to leave behind the clamor of life, and sink gently into the soft embrace of night.